Hello to everyone. Our guest today is Michael Plummer, Director, SAIS Europe and ENI, Professor of International Economics and Director at the Johns Hopkins University of Bologna. Thanks, Director, to joining us.
My pleasure.
It's interesting to know that in Baltimore, the Johns Hopkins University has the world's largest medical school, the only one that in real time updates the world about the coronavirus pandemic data. That's correct?
Yes, that's correct. We have a very large medical school, and this has been a very important initiative since the beginning of the crisis.
Director Plummer, there are some people who believe that the COVID-19 will revolutionize the planet and the entire world's order will be turned upside down. Other people believe that this could lead to the end of globalization. According to others, the crisis will further accelerate China's growth and the European Union decline. A little disturbing scenery, isn't it?
It certainly is. This crisis was unexpected and has really changed all of our worlds very much. The IMF recently estimated that this year global growth will shrink by 3%, and other institutions have forecasts also big declines. Italy, for example, is expected to contract by 9.1% this year. But what I note is that in the IMF's projections and other projections, the economists believe that there will be a strong rebound next year. So most economists that are looking at the situation see a big hit this year, but they don't see some sort of major risk to the global system, as was the case, for example, in the crisis of 2008-2009. So I'm far less nervous about that in the rebound. But I believe you're right that it does raise a lot of questions about attitudes about globalization and its effects. My own view is that what it will do is underscore how important it is to cooperate, that international cooperation in an age of globalization, like it or not, is critical. And this is something that I believe we'll learn. In terms of the acceleration of China, I think that, as you know, China's economic growth has been decelerating for a while, and China will have quite a few of its own problems. It has major debt issues, and it certainly isn't out of the water yet with respect to the economic fallout from the COVID crisis. So I don't see, a situation where China is going to accelerate and the EU decelerate, yet I do believe we have a lot of fundamental economic problems in Europe that we need to address. And perhaps this COVID crisis will open our eyes to the need to prioritize that.
Do you think that nowadays internationalism is weak, diluted by COVID outbreak and the fight for hegemony between the United States and China?
I certainly believe that there has been a lot of backlash against globalization and such. The US-China conflict started way before the COVID crisis did. You may recall that there was what we call the US-China trade war that had a truce beginning in December of 2019 when the Phase 1 agreement came in, and that sort of put us on at least, not necessarily on a bright path to the future, but at least something that looked a bit more optimistic. And since the COVID crisis has hit, I don't think it seems to be very encouraging. But I don't believe this is going to be a fundamental issue going forward in many ways, because I think that it's something that will have to be resolved. I think the United States and China will themselves realize that the cost of this conflict is extremely high. In fact, with my co-author, we've done some estimates of the economic cost of the US-China trade war, and it came up to over $300 billion. And by far, of course, the biggest losers were China and the United States. And so as the U.S. economy slows down, it's going into recession, I think that these economic variables will become much more important and will bring the United States back to the table with China to sort of work out a deal that's going to be longer term.
The Trump administration policy is defined as a nationalist, a doctrine whose mission is to protect people from global economic and social pressures. Initially, this doctrine seems to benefit the people of the country, but would this work out in a long term?
Absolutely not. In my view, it is very myopic to do it, and in some ways, the approach of the Trump administration is completely at odds with U.S. policy in the past, and particularly Republican Party policy in the past, which tends to, for example, be very pro-free trade, very pro-open markets. And so this new approach is something that I think is with the Trump administration, and hopefully will be the same, will only be a Trump trademark afterwards, and we won't see something like that after his administration. I think what we've also seen is, when we talk about what's going on now with the COVID crisis, is that something that's been good that's come out of the Trump administration has been a very decisive fiscal expansion of about $2.4 trillion. And of course, this is coming right after reports of the second quarter trade deficit budget deficit of the United States, which was almost $800 billion. So at a time when we already had record budget deficits, now we're going to have $2.4 trillion in more deficits. And so, but it's been an important thing to do in terms of this emergency, and the Trump administration has effectively worked with the Democrats in order to address these problems. And of course, trying to get the Democrats to spend more often is like trying to get an alcoholic to drink whiskey. They're very famous for this kind of spending, but it really was the right thing to do. I think if you look at the way the Trump administration has handled the crisis afterwards, it's been very mixed in terms of messaging in the crisis, the gravity of the crisis, the role of the individual states and the federal government. So that has been a real problem. But it is certainly the Trump administration in its approach, I don't think will last a long time, but will be the detriment of the future of the U.S. economy.
The globalization at the time of sovereignism, nationalism. There's a strong contrast between the two terms. How could we get out of this situation in COVID-19 times?
That's an excellent question, and I do believe, I really hope that the lesson is learned that by sharing information, it's very clear that we're able to all be better off. And the Chinese, who had to go through this crisis first, has immediately began to share information on the COVID problems and the sequencing and these things. And so this helped scientists throughout the world to get a better feel for how to prepare for a vaccine in the future. And so that's an example of how global cooperation can be beneficial, and I think that needs to be trumpeted. The other problem, however, that I think we've seen is this nationalistic backlash, which I think you're referring to, of, say, export controls. Or even Germany was going to have export controls of health-related items, and that didn't last that long, but it became EU-wide, and yet it was going to be extended internationally. The Trump administration this morning also is saying it's not going to issue green cards anymore, permanent residency status and things. So I think there's a few steps forward, but a few steps backwards as well. And what we're going to learn afterwards is that these both lead to underscore the need to cooperate more with each other, because if, for example, I don't think I'm going to be able to get masks in my country because there's a crisis, I'm going to want to produce masks. And if I think there's going to be a food shortage, I'm going to want to produce food. And if there's going to be a shortage of ventilators, then that's what I'm going to do. And if you do that, you take away all the benefits of the international marketplace, and that would be a great way to impoverish the world. So I think that we need to learn these lessons, and I'm confident we will. But whether or not we learn them in the short run is another matter.
Since President Trump's taking office, the transatlantic policy has shaken the strong partnership with Italy and other European Union countries. This has weakened America's friend, undermining multilateral alliances and choosing confrontation over cooperation. Sanctions, embargoes and boycotts aimed at China in Europe have been globally divisive. What's the secret plan of President Trump? What's the aim at?
Well, I think that above everything, that President Trump thinks of himself as a great negotiator. And what he is doing is, in his negotiations, he, as he did in his business life, is playing what we call hardball with individual countries to try to get what he perceives the best deal for the country. And so I think that's what his plan is. And, behind that is a lot of political motivations that the president has in moving forward in that way. But I think that it is, an interesting question what happens in the future. We're not talking about it that much right now. But normally, in a regular year, the front pages would all be covered with the U.S. election in November. That's obviously been knocked out of the front pages, but what happens in November is going to be critical to the future of these U.S.-EU relationships. I think very much because of the things that you were saying in terms of less multilateralism and more inward-looking approaches to relationships. Or would it be what would seem to be the Biden approach? And it looks like Joe Biden will be the Democratic presidential candidate, who is a more traditional moderate Democrat in the Obama mold that would work with international organizations, with multilateral approaches to address issues, and I think will place cooperation with the EU at the forefront. And so I think we could see that happen. And I think that could only be to the benefit, not just the world, but the benefit of the United States. Because, for example, President Trump obviously took a very hard line with China, ratcheting up tariffs in a way that brings us back to the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, et cetera. But he would have been much more effective if he had worked with the Europeans, because if you go and you look at his complaints, his issues of forced technology transfer, his issues of intellectual property protection, trade secrets, these things, they're all priorities on the European side as well. So if the Trump administration had cooperated more with the Europeans, he would have had a much better hand in his negotiations. So I think the fact that he wants to go it alone has even reduced his effectiveness as a negotiator.
According to the economist Carlo Cottarelli, now from ECB, the European Central Bank, there is solidarity towards Italy more than ever. What's your opinion about the disagreements between Italy and European members concerning the economical measures taken in order to mitigate the economic impact of the pandemic that could provide more than 1 trillion of euros?
I think that the conflicts that we've seen between, Italy and some of the other countries are ongoing, and the question mark about, what Italy should be doing in terms of its commitments on its deficits and with respect to its debt levels and things. But I think that rightly, Italy has been emphasizing that we are in a crisis period and we need to be working on this all together. So we have to have a joint initiative in moving forward. And frankly, Italy was at the front lines of this, right? Italy was the first European country to be heavily affected by this crisis. So, and I think that the European nations have come around to that, to giving Italy more flexibility and flexibility to address its own situation, but also these things have to be dealt with in a cooperative manner. Because if, for example, if it were only Italy stimulating its economy because of this, there would be positive spillovers to other European countries. It only makes sense for Italy if other countries are also stimulating their economy. So when we start to come out of this, we all come out of it together. And we are so integrated here in Europe. From an economic point of view, we have to act together. Just like we have to act politically, we have to act together in terms of health and these sorts of issues. So I think that what people are looking at Europe right now to see how a cohesive regional organization can confront a common problem in a way that could have important ramifications internationally. So I think that Italy is in the right on this, and I think the Europeans are coming around to it.
And to conclude, do you think that this crisis could be a beginning of a new era?
I think that it will certainly influence the next era. I do not believe that we are on the brink of a new Great Depression. I do not believe that this is the end of the global liberal order. I don't believe in any of those things. However, I do believe that the importance of public policy, particularly in the area of health and cooperation, is going to be a much greater priority in the future for all countries. And so I think we're going to have new institutions that are going to be developed in order to address these common problems, in order to manage risks better, because you and I may not have heard of it, but people really were nervous that there would be another sort of pandemic that would hit us. We just ignored them. And I think that's going to open our eyes up to the need to have better risk management approaches to public policy. So I definitely think that's going to happen, but I don't think it's going to lead to a new era of global protectionism and an inward approach to globalization completely. That certainly is my hope, and it's my expectation that will not happen.
Thank you very much, Director Plummer, and thank you all for watching. See you soon.